Sorry. Okay. So this second lecture is a little bit different. It's a topic that I've also written about and done research on. It's not my everyday. My everyday is Israeli politics. But I'm going to tell you about anti-Israel sort of sentiment and activism on the far left and the roots and the history of it, and how it creeps into anti-Semitism. So I want to open with a little bit of a story. Betty Friedan, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, but for those who haven't, she wrote in the 1960s the book The Feminine Mystique, which was considered the book that launched the second wave of feminism, which came together with the civil rights movement in the U.S. So she was a big figure in feminism in the middle of the 20th century. And she was also a Jewish woman. In 1975, Betty Friedan, 12 years after she published her groundbreaking book, The Feminine Mystique, she was part of an American delegation to a UN-affiliated event called the International Women's Year World Conference in Mexico City. Now, Betty Friedan, as I said, she was a Jewish woman, but she wasn't active. She wasn't an observant woman. She didn't really have anything to do with Israel. You know, in all of her activism, it was about feminism and about women's issues. When she arrived, because it's a UN event, there were representatives there were women from all around the world sort of representing their women's issues. But she quickly found that most of the women there were not interested in issues of equality, of equal civil rights for women. And a draft was coming together of the resolution that the women there were going to put together. And the influential figures, the way it often is in the UN, because it's one country, one vote, were from the third world, including the Arab world, and of course at the time there was the communist bloc. And they had the big influence, and they wrote a resolution where they condemned, and again, this is the Declaration on the Equality of Women. They condemned imperialism, neocolonialism, racism, apartheid, and Zionism. That's what they decided in this thing of this way. This is how they wanted equality for women in 1975. And also notice they didn't list sexism. Now, this was a precursor to the United Nations declaring Zionism equals racism and attempts in the UN to try to throw Israel out of the UN. Now, Betty Friedan, who was known as this big feminist figure, she was horrified. And so were a lot of representatives from the Western world, from Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and they tried to fight this. They said that's not what this conference is supposed to be about. But they didn't succeed because of the whole one country, one vote way the UN institutions are built. But from then on, Betty Friedan actually, because she felt that she had experienced anti-Semitism, she talked about, this is a quote, the use of feminism itself as an anti-Semitic political tool. From then on, because people were, grouping Zionism in with all these other things in this sort of crazy setting, she became actually very active. She got a lot of other feminist activists, including Gloria Steinem, who again is one of the big names of feminism of the 20th century, but also happens to be Jewish, to support Israel when the UN was trying to throw Israel out. But at that conference itself, she had to be escorted by security because there were concerns about her physical safety, that she would be assaulted. Leah Rabin was there. It was when Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister in the 1970s. She also needed security to leave. She was boycotted. And this inspired Betty Friedan because she saw a negative trend happening in feminist organizations outside the U.S. And so she actually, for the rest of her life, she became more dedicated to Israel. I tell this story because I think a lot of people think that this kind of thing is new. and it's not. I just have an example here. I'm just giving feminist organizations as an example. In 2015, the National Women's Studies Association, which is the largest feminist academic organization in North America, joined the BDS movement. They said, this is a quote, in the spirit of this intersectional perspective, we cannot overlook the injustice and violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, perpetrated against Palestinians and other Arabs in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, within Israel and on the Golan Heights, as well as the colonial displacement of hundreds and thousands of Palestinians during the 1948 Nakba. The Nakba is the term Palestinians use to describe Israel's establishment. They call it, it means catastrophe. The catastrophe for them is what Israel calls, our Israeli independence. There is basically no record of Israel inflicting sexual violence on Palestinians. None. Yeah. If you could find one case, 2 cases, I'll be very shocked. But it's not a thing that's happening or historically happened. And of course, and if it was happening, you would say this is the feminist organization. That would make sense for them to talk about. But A, it's not happening. And B, the colonial displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948. What is a feminist academic organization in 2015 doing talking about that, right? The one definition of feminism that's grown popular in recent years is feminist means a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. But you look at what these organizations were doing in 1975 and what this academic group is doing in 2015, and I'm sure there's even more recent examples. It's just one that I found. And it's confusing. I mean, I'm a woman. I want equal social, political, and economic rights. But what does this have to do with any of that? So feminism is just sort of an example that I give about how some of the organizations on the far left, and in this case, these are more radical feminist organizations. I am by no means writing off feminism here. But these are things that reflect outward. In your neighbors in Sweden, for example, for a few years had a feminist foreign policy, right? Margot Wallström was the former foreign minister. And somehow that meant her being very hostile to Israel, but very friendly to Iran and willingly putting a scarf on her head when she goes to Iran, where, of course, women are now being arrested for wanting to take off their scarves. So I'm going to put a pin in that, and I'm going to get back to that. And I want to tell you why I'm talking about the left right now and not the right. I think that most people know how to recognize anti-Semitism on the right, because anti-Semitism on the right is a bit more cliched, okay? Especially when it comes from neo-Nazis. That's what people picture in their heads when they say anti-Semitism. That's what I think that mainstream Western media warns about and talks about. And so I think people know how to recognize those signs and to point them out and to say that's anti-Semitic, that's not okay. For example, if there was a member of parliament in Norway that was working with an organization, and that organization posted on its website that Passover, they're a pro-Palestinian organization, and they post on their website that on Passover, Jews use Christian children's blood in their rituals. You would say, okay, that's obviously anti-Semitism, and it would be an outrage. You would say, why is a member of our parliament in our enlightened country working with someone like that? Well, remember a few months ago that 2 members, or I don't know if you remember, I don't know if it was in the news here in Norway, but certainly in Israel and in the US it was in the news a few months ago that 2 members of Congress in the US wanted to visit Israel. And Israel decided not to let them in. Now, why didn't Israel let them in, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar? Because they were working with an organization that did just that. The organization that organized their trip to Palestinian areas, called Miftach, it's run by Hanan Ashrawi, who's a leading member of the PLO. In 2013, her organization published an article that said that President Obama should not have had a Passover Seder, which is the main meal of the Passover holiday, in the White House because the food probably has Christian blood in it. But the only people who seem to notice and care are people like us in this room. I mean, all the pro-Israel organizations in the U.S. were publishing articles about, people agree or disagree about whether Israel should have let those congresswomen in, but everyone agreed that this organization is beyond the pale. And yet, it didn't make waves further out than the pro-Israel community. So this is why, because people ask this question, why do I want to focus on the left? This is why I want to focus on the left, because I think that it gets ignored. And I think that, these people need to be called out as well. Now, part of how the left covers up anti-Semitism is by claiming anti-Zionism. Right? And you look at that statement from 1975, they say they're against imperialism, colonialism, and Zionism. Why are they just singling out Israel? Let's say you agreed Israel was imperialist and colonialist. I disagree, but let's say you agreed. Are they the only colonialists in the world? No. They certainly now, 71 years after Israel's establishment, a plurality of the Jews in the world live in Israel. To say that the state of Israel shouldn't exist, I believe, is an anti-Semitic statement. Now, there's a quote that I'll read to you by this author and scholar, Dara Horn. She's written some novels, and she's also a scholar of Yiddish literature. And she talks about the difference between the Jewish holiday of Purim and the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. And I will very quickly tell you what those holidays are about so you understand her quote. Purim is in ancient Persia, the Jews living in ancient Persia. They were a very successful diaspora Jewish community. And the king's top advisor said to the king, there's these people who they answer to in authority other than you, the king. They're different from everyone else. They speak a different language. They eat different foods. And the king agreed that this advisor can arrange for the Jews to all be killed. In the end, the Jews triumph. We have a very lovely holiday every year called Purim. In the story of Hanukkah, there are other elements to the story. I'm just telling you what's important to the point I'm making. In the story of Hanukkah, it was in what is now Israel, which was being ruled by Assyrians, basically, or Greeks. They were all sort of one big monolith at the time, one empire. And they weren't going out to kill all the Jews. They passed laws that the Jews could not observe Judaism. They couldn't learn Torah. The boys couldn't be circumcised. They couldn't slaughter animals in the way it's kosher. And there were other things. So they weren't trying to kill the Jews as people. They were trying to kill the Jews as a separate society, as a separate civilization. So this woman, Dara Horn, wrote something that I think is very apt. The Purim story from ancient Persia fits well into 7th grade notions of prejudice. Bad guy notices Jews are different and therefore contaminating the blood and soil, so he decides to get rid of them. It resembles what we now consider right-wing anti-Semitism. It's the kind that Jews descended from survivors of the Russian Empire pogroms or from Holocaust survivors have been taught to recognize. Hanukkah anti-Semitism can rear its head either on the right or left and is something different. It doesn't demand dead or expelled Jews at first. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Over the centuries, right, you've had movements that have accused Jews of being communists and have accused Jews of being fascists and, or whatever is the most of society doesn't like, Jews get accused of being that. And I find that the left-wing anti-Semitism, the left-wing anti-Israel sentiment has to do with that. Now, if we go back to the feminists, right, why are they throwing Israel in with all of these other categories that they don't like? It's because of something called intersectionality. The definition, I'll read you the official definition the dictionary definition before I explain it to you, at least the way I understand it. The definition is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So let's say you live in a society where, let's talk about the U.S., okay? In the U.S., there's some level of discrimination against African Americans in certain areas and certain places. If you're an African American woman, then there's, say, people who follow intersectionality will say that your issues are compounded, that you are in a sort of, maybe weaker is not the right word, but you're in two categories that are discriminated against, and there's an intersection. And the focus of intersectionality, it's useful in some ways because you can't deny when different people have different issues. Even in the case of Palestinian women, right? The Palestinians, they live in a constant state of limbo where they don't really know what their political situation is going to be. And it's in large part of their own making because they won't stop attacking Israel physically. But either way, the average Palestinian, to some extent, suffers from that situation. There's no denying that. And also, the Palestinians have a highly patriarchal society. And so you can talk about Palestinian women are suffering even more so. I think that that's true, and you can say that that's an intersectional way of looking at it. So in some ways, it's useful. But on the other hand, the dominance of intersectionality in a lot of far left movements, it glorifies victimhood. It says the more ways that you can call yourself a victim, the more right you have to speak, the more right you have to be heard. Now, Jews were once the biggest victims, right? After the Holocaust, Jews were the biggest victims in the world. But we asserted ourselves and we stood up for ourselves. We have our own country, a very powerful country, a very successful country at that. And so for people for whom this is their way of looking at the world, this intersectionality, this hierarchy of grievances, Israel is at the bottom of the totem pole. And a lot of the far left thought that goes together with this is anti-imperialist, which really just means anti-Western. Because when being a victim is the peak of moral righteousness, then they feel like the left is inherently immoral because of the not-so-distant past of things that much of the West did to the global South. And I'm not here to defend imperialism, but it doesn't mean that people should automatically say everything the West does is bad and everything former colonies do is good. And to some extent, that's the outlook, and that's where Israel falls. And so in the Middle East, and in some cases justifiably, they can say that the West let them down, that the West really hurt them. And so these groups will look at the Middle Eastern countries and say that they have a just cause. Now, there's often a coalition in Western countries between refugees or just immigrants from Muslim countries and the left, because overall in Europe and in the US, the left is more for helping immigrants, is more for social services to help underserved and underprivileged communities. And so even though I think on a lot of social issues, like very religious Muslim people maybe wouldn't agree with the left, they tend to have a political alliance. And so that's why, even though Islamists are not the radical left, you often see alliances in this way. And so Israel is an ally of the West. Also, if you look at the polls from the Anti-Defamation League, Middle Eastern countries, people hold, massive swaths of the people, a majority of the people in the Middle East hold anti-Semitic views. So these things come together. When you have anti-Western, anti-imperialist, colonialist views, Israel suddenly becomes the bad guy. In Iran, the mullahs and also in other parts of the Middle East, they often talk about the big Satan and the little Satan. The big Satan is America, the little Satan is Israel. So that it all plays into this dynamic. And so this is how they package our story of Jewish revival in our historic homeland. There's a continuous Jewish presence for millennia, but they package it as imperialism. They even call it white supremacy. Now, I don't know if you know, because a lot of people are surprised to learn this, although I think this is a knowledgeable group. The majority of Jews in Israel are not from Europe. The majority of the Jews in Israel are from North Africa and the Middle East at this point, over generations. So even this idea that Israel is a white supremacist endeavor, even by these people's definitions of what is white, doesn't really make sense. In any case, almost all of these messages that you hear, anti-Western, anti-imperialist, calling anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, even the idea that Jews are white supremacists, which is crazy within living memory of the Holocaust, they all have their roots in the Soviet Union's anti-Semitic propaganda, and I have a lot of examples. So, in the early decades of the Soviet Union, right, they had this idea that all the different ethnic groups living in the Soviet Union are equal in theory. And so they didn't want to say that they were anti-Semitic. They didn't want to say that they don't like Jews. But a lot of Jews, and this is before the establishment of the State of Israel, there were a lot of Zionist groups. I mean, even, David Ben-Gurion came from, what's now Russia. A lot of the early Zionists came from what's now Russia. So even before Israel existed, the Soviet Union saw Zionism as a problem. So what they did is they recruited a group of Jews who were not Zionists. They were called the Yevsektia, to work against Zionists within the Jewish community. Now, today, the vast majority of Jews in the world are what I would consider to be Zionists. Some people mistake Zionism and they think Zionism means you support every single thing Israel does, and it's not. I think that in the 21st century, Zionism means you support Israel's right to exist as the Jewish state. Jews deserve self-determination in their homeland, more or less. So between the US and the UK, polls show that over 90% of Jews support that. So today, a lot of these left-wing movements, like the Soviet Union did, they will drag out a few Jews who oppose that view and will say, we're not anti-Semitic because, look, this Jew thinks so too. But it's tokenism, right? If you have, millions of Jews in the world and you can find a few hundred who think something, that doesn't represent the Jews. So that tokenism is also something that was happening already back then in Soviet anti-Semitic propaganda. Now, the actual content of the propaganda is also very similar beyond this use of tokenism. Now, in the early days of Israel, as Israel's establishment, it wasn't so clear where Israel would fall, whether Israel would be more pro-Soviet or pro-US. So there was a short period where things quieted down. The Soviets were not so vocally anti-Israel. It didn't last very long, especially in the early 1950s. There was what was called the Doctors' Plot, where Stalin killed a lot of doctors, and most of them happened to be Jewish. And for a lot of Israelis who were socialists, that was a turning point where they became anti-Soviet, even though they were still socialists. But the real turning point for Soviet anti-Israel sentiment was after the Six-Day War. From that point on, they really intensified their anti-Israel propaganda. They published hundreds of books and thousands of articles against Israel in 80 foreign languages, and they had radio stations broadcasting around the world. So all over the Third World, the Middle East, for sure, these things were being published and spread. But also in the West, some of these materials were available for, there were communist parties in different countries in the West, even if they weren't communist countries. So a big theme in this is taking classic anti-Semitic comparisons and replacing Jews with Zionists. And it wasn't just, there were cartoons where the Zionist or the Israeli would have a big hook nose, or you would have an octopus with its tentacles all around the globe with the Israeli flag on it, things like that. So there's beyond that, but they decided to take Jews and, classically in medieval anti-Semitic texts and drawings and things, Jews were compared to devils. People thought to this day, sometimes you meet a person and they think that Jewish men wear a kippah because it covers their horns. So obviously very ignorant people think this, but it dates back hundreds of years. So the Soviets decided to take Jews, the idea of Jews as devils or demons, and to turn Israel into the devil or demon of the 20th century, the Nazis. And you even see this with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Does anyone know what he wrote his doctorate about?
Yes.
Who said yes?
I said yes.
Want to tell us?
Yes, the same stuff as you have told you about. Anti-Semitism in practice.
So Abbas wrote his doctorate saying that the Zionists collaborated with the Nazis. And where did he get his doctorate? At Patrice Lumumba University, which is a university in the Soviet Union, where basically foreign radicals from around the world would come and study. So that's, Abbas was actually part of this propaganda idea. Now, there's something else that I've seen. I'm very active online, on Twitter and on other social media defending Israel, and I've seen people call Israel white supremacist. I mentioned that earlier, and they'll often tie it in with the Jewish idea that the Jews are God's chosen people. The Soviets were the first to take the Nazi phrase of the master race, that the Nazis consider Aryans to be the master race, and to say that the Jews call themselves the master race. They took that same term to misrepresent this Jewish idea of the chosen people. So, it still exists. There's reverberations about that today. And these are things that come from the protocols of the elders of Zion. These are things that come from religious anti-Semitism from, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. And they even took concepts from Mein Kampf, even though, they claim to hate the Nazis, and they would just adopt it to Marxism. So, when people once said Jews controlled the banks, now they say Zionists control the money. Zionists use their money to buy politicians. And, earlier this year, we had Ilhan Omar in the U.S. saying that it's all about the Benjamins, right? That Israel supports, this is something she wrote on Twitter. All about the Benjamins is a line from a rap song that's about making a lot of money. So I've discovered not everyone knows that, so I'm clarifying it. She said that about AIPAC. She said that the reason that America supports Israel is because of money. And Rashida Tlaib, the other congresswoman who was denied entry to Israel, she made similar comments about Israeli money controlling the position. So these are things that, again, have reverberations to this day. And even the blood libel, which I had mentioned earlier, that Palestinian organization is spreading the blood libel, you see versions of that in, anti-Israel extremists claiming that Israel harvests organs or that Israel is intentionally targeting children. Now, we know that this propaganda that claimed was supposed to be anti-Israel led to a lot of Jewish deaths and Jewish oppression in the Soviet Union, right? There were purges, there was the doctor's plot that I mentioned, prisoners of Zion who were sent to Siberia for many, many years, and the Jews were trapped in the Soviet Union. They couldn't leave it even if they wanted to. I'm not saying that that's what these far left-wing activists, whether we're talking about the U.S., whether we're talking about Jeremy Corbyn, I'm sure you have your own local versions of it. I'm not saying that that's the danger here, but I think that the left needs to take responsibility and they need to see the roots of their messages. They can't spread these messages of, Israel harvesting organs or Israel using its money to influence around the world without realizing that it's the same as that cartoon of the octopus with its tentacles all over the world that, in classic anti-Semitic propaganda from 120 years ago. And part of what I think really makes you realize how this works, is the horseshoe theory. The horseshoe theory is a horseshoe is shaped like the letter U, right? And the two sides are very close to each other at the top in a horseshoe, right? So the horseshoe theory says the extremes on both sides, the right and the left, are actually very close to each other. And you see this when it comes to anti-Semitism. The former head of the KKK, the big white supremacist organization in the U.S., David Duke, he has expressed admiration for some of the figures on the anti-Israel far left in the U.S. Or David Irving, the famous Holocaust denier who, was on trial who sued Deborah Lipstadt, the historian. There was that big trial in the UK in the late 1990s. He said he supports Jeremy Corbyn, the extremely anti-Israel now candidate for prime minister in the UK. So I think that these are things that people need to be aware of, that people need to know on the far left, that they might think that they're just criticizing Israel, but what they're really doing is perpetuating tropes that can lead to hate crimes and have led to hate crimes against Jews. And that these kinds of messages are mainstreaming anti-Semitism by using a fig leaf of anti-Zionism. And I hope that this helps you when you encounter people that are using these kinds of messages to try to undermine what they're saying, and to dig in and really show them the message that they're spreading is not constructive criticism of Israel. It's actually an anti-Semitic message. Thank you. And I can take questions.
Yep. Any questions?
Hallo? Der var
You must be next to something.
Well, I was going to ask about
Maybe I don't need it.
Yeah, if you stand up and speak loud, maybe.
I can take like this.
Okay.
What exactly did Jeremy Corbyn say? Is he really an anti-Semite? That was one thing. I saw the Soviet Union. Young people today, they just don't know what the Soviet Union was. They know about Russia, Ukraine, and the most clever about Belarus, but not the Soviet Union as a system. Actually, I think, which I didn't mention, Soviet threatened to bomb Israel before and after the Kippur War in '73. Maybe also they threatened with the atomic bomb. But they didn't only have advisors. They had soldiers, technical personnel, and of course those SAM-2 rockets from Russia. Well, I remember how the Norwegian public reacted, especially the students. They were kind of they just admired, decided with the Egyptian when they had this breakthrough during the first 3 days when Golda Meir and also Diana was, astonished. Okay.
Okay, so there's a few questions. I'll try to. I think we can categorize it as two questions. The first question is, what did Jeremy Corbyn say? Is he really an anti-Semite? I don't know what is in Jeremy Corbyn's heart and in his mind, and I also think that a lot of people who say these things about Israel, they don't necessarily intend to be anti-Semitic. They don't necessarily understand the history or the implications of what they're saying. And I think in the case of Corbyn, I could give lots of examples. I'll just give one. He laid a wreath on the graves of the terrorists from Black September who killed Israeli athletes in the Munich Olympics. And you're laying a wreath, you're honoring these people who did, this horrifying thing. And overall,
He put flowers
yes, there's photographs of it.
Black September?
Yes, there's photographs of it.
Oh my God.
Now, he gives these sort of mealy-mouthed, like, these people were my hosts, they told me to put flowers here. When you're a political leader, you need to take responsibility for your actions. That's not acceptable, I think, at least. And overall, there's a lot of very anti-Israel and anti-Semitic things that people in his party have been saying, and he's done very little to uproot it. There was recently a BBC program about people who worked in the ombudsman department of the Labour Party, so they get the complaints from people within the party, and about how basically all of the complaints of anti-Semitism were not taken seriously and ignored. And I think all of the Jewish members of parliament from Labour have resigned because they feel that the party has become systemically anti-Semitic. If it's not all of them, then it's almost all of them. So I think that in Corbyn's case, I don't think that he's a person who hates Jews, but I think he's a person who who grew politically and surrounded himself politically with these radical circles that they say these exact same things that I brought up in my lecture. And because he agrees with them on so many other things, he just, accepts this as part of the package, thinks it's right, maybe didn't go further with it. And I really do think that's the case with a lot of people. I really think that there's just a lot of ignorance, and people will say, well, if I agree with this person on one thing, they're probably right about the other thing too, The other thing you had said is that young people don't know about the Soviet Union. And even when young people knew about the Soviet Union, you said some in Norway sided with Israel's enemies, or even the Soviets in the Yom Kippur War, for example. I don't really have much to say about what happened during the Yom Kippur War, because also it was a long time ago. But as far as young people, you're right. Young people today, a lot of people don't know about the Soviet Union, or they just don't think it's relevant. I had a good friend who was the spokesman for Natan Sharansky, and I'm sure you all know who Natan Sharansky is. And he would say that there was a huge difference between, and this one, Sharansky was the head of the Jewish Agency. There was a huge difference between when they would go to a young crowd, didn't really know who he was, and when you go to an older crowd and they would look at him and see him as a hero. So you're definitely right. There's a difference there. I think people need to be educated. I think specifically if somebody is saying something that can be tied to a historic anti-Semitic trope, you don't need to give them the whole history of communism and the Soviet Union. You can just tell them this specific thing. Look, this was a country that they created these messages, they spread them throughout the world, and they also killed many Jews. They basically ghettoized a lot of Jews. If you're having a discussion with someone, then you can at least give some information. But you're right. I mean, I think overall, polls show in the U.S. that young people, millennials, which is the generation I'm considered part of, they don't value free speech as much as earlier generations. They don't value the free market as much as earlier generations. So it's so you have to think about that, I guess, and speak on their level, or on their, not on their level. I'm not saying they're on a lower level, but to speak to your audience in a way that they'll appreciate and understand. I mean, that's in any sort of argument or in any situation where you're giving a talk, for example, you have to take that into consideration.
Yes. If I try to discuss these issues on Israel with people on the left side in Norwegian politics, I always get told that I'm a crazy rightist, like extreme. So my question is, I feel like I can ask you this question. If you don't know, you can say no. But do you know? Can you suggest any books or researchers or papers or people who have written about this that I can suggest for my friends in the leftist politics in Norway to read, so they can catch up on these issues?
So there's an author, let me double check that it's... Okay, there's an author I really like named Yossi Klein Halevi. He wrote, I think, one of my favorite books about Israeli history called Like Dreamers. And it's about the brigade that liberated Jerusalem in 1967 and the life stories of all the different people, or not all, but a number of different people in the brigade who went on to be prominent figures. One became one of Israel's most famous rock stars, and one became a spy who was arrested spying for Syria, and one became a major rabbi. And that's a really interesting book to read about, I think, the diversity of Israeli society in general. But for the kind of debates you're having, this man, Yossi Klein Halevi, he wrote a book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which he literally wrote to his Palestinian neighbor, that he knows Palestinians, he's friends with them, and he's trying to sort of adjudicate and figure out the situation together with him, because he recognizes the humanity of this person in front of him and the way that person is suffering. But he also knows the ways Israelis suffer and the issues that Israelis need and the security that Israelis need. And this is a new book. It just came out last year. And I think that it's a very good book to give that kind of person so that they can see that Israelis are not, or most Israelis are not trying to dehumanize Palestinians, and they want Palestinians to have good lives as well. And that liking one side doesn't mean that you're delegitimizing the other side. I think it's a problem in general that you're trying to have a discussion with these people and they just say, oh, you're an extremist. They're trying to delegitimize you. So maybe they'll also learn how to have a debate without delegitimizing the other side and really listening from this book as well.
When it's a question of Norway, of course it could be a coincidence, but it was when Histadrut had the power in Israel, then the Norwegian Labour Party was very pro, also because they had a general secretary at that time, Håkon Lie, who was very, very fond of Israel. So the moment when it happened, strangely enough, that when we had the trouble then with the heavy water, which was sold by in Norway,
Yes.
was sold by a foreign minister from the Christian party. And you know, this is internal Norwegian, which has nothing to do with feminism, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So,
To
an answer.
Histadrut, they lost.
So, I mean, first of all, I just gave feminism as an example of a left-wing movement. I think the sort of processes that I was talking about in feminism happen in other sort of far left-wing. Just Jeremy Corbyn, for example, calls himself an anti-racist. He says that's, his big thing. And these things happen. Feminism was just the example I gave. But it's true that there are labor unions, not just in Norway, throughout Europe, that have sort of turned on Israel, that have led efforts to boycott Israel. So the Histadrut in Israel is the labor union. They're not the political party. The political party was Labour, and Labour has not been in power since 2001. That's when Ehud Barak left office. There have been centrists in power, but not the Labour Party. But the Histadrut is still the big labor union in Israel. But as Israel has freed up its markets over the past 25 years or so, they have less power. However, they're still active in international labor movement bodies and things, and I think that they've only very recently begun to realize that they, as Israel's main labor union, have the power to do outreach and to stop or to try to convince other labor unions, other parts of the world, to try to, not to boycott Israel or to be friendlier to Israel. So the Histadrut has hired an English language spokesman, someone named Peter Lerner, very, very talented. He used to be a spokesman for the IDF, which, I don't know, I wonder maybe some people in international labor movements won't like that about him, but you can't take his talent away from him. And so I hope that he'll be more effective in helping them in the international forums. I would say it's not just the labor forums, it's not just the labor unions, it's also the labor parties. Israel's Labor Party, for example, has come up with a lot of conflict, I guess I would say, in the Internationale, the big forum of socialist and social democrat parties. And the Internationale supported BDS recently. I think it was in 2017. I don't remember exactly, but I actually reported on it at the time. And the Labour Party in Israel had a lot of delegates there, and they really tried to fight it. They tried to talk to their contacts in parties around the world. It's not an easy situation. I mean, the global left at the moment is having a very anti-Israel moment. And there's something almost ironic to it in the sense that, some of the countries that they're supporting don't have great workers' rights or women's rights or gay rights. And Israel is certainly the best in the Middle East and is better even than some countries in the West on these matters. But it all boils down to this concept of intersectionality, of glorifying the victims, and that they feel that these countries are bigger victims than Israel. Anyone else?
So I have one question.
Sure.
Could you describe your own family's relations to Zionism, like if you go 2 or 3 generations back, and even if you look onto the future of your own children's future in
Sure.
Israel?
Sure. I mean, my personal story in relation to Zionism. My mother's side, my mother is Israeli. My father is American. Depending on which side, he's either 4th generation American or 2nd generation American. I'll tell my father's story with Zionism is much shorter, which is that his parents, his grandparents on his father's side, they experienced pogroms in Ukraine, and they were able to move to America, where they gave birth to my grandfather. Where they had my grandfather, and my grandfather was very, very Zionist. My father grew up in a very secular home, but very pro-Israel. They would give money to Israel. They loved Israel. On my mother's side of the family, they have a long Zionist story. I have great-grandparents who moved to Israel from Eastern Europe in around World War I already. And they helped build this town called Kfar Hasidim, and then they had a farm in a town called Petach Tikva, which is outside Tel Aviv, and it's like a real city, so it's always funny to me when I look there and I say, my family had a farm here, because it really is a city now. And on the other side of my mother's side, my grandfather's side, he was born in Berlin in the late 1930s, and his parents smuggled him out. He had a cousin who was a teenage girl who got an exit visa and was able to go to, it was then mandatory Palestine. And she hid my grandfather, who was a baby, in her bag and took him with her to Israel. Eventually, because they were actually pretty wealthy in Germany, my great-grandparents were able to bribe people and find their way and meet with their baby in Israel not much after. So that was how my grandfather's side of the family, they escaped the Holocaust to Israel. Very strong Zionism on that side of the family, both, my grandmother and my grandfather's side. But they did move to the U.S., you could hear from my accent, when my mother was a child, for education, for my grandfather to get a doctorate, and they ended up staying there. But I always grew up in a home, we spoke Hebrew at home, we went to Israel every single year, and eventually, when I got to an age where I started thinking about what I wanted to do with my life after high school, I said, well, I want to be in Israel. So my parents were like, I don't know, we like Israel, we don't know if we want you to move halfway across the world, you should apply to some colleges in America. I was like, okay, fine, I applied to some colleges in America. And I'd get the letters that I was accepted to most of them, the ones I applied to, and I would just be like, but I really don't want to go. I'm like, everyone's like, my friends are all really excited that they get into this college or that college, and I was like, but I just really don't, I want to go to Israel. So my parents were like, fine, you could go for a couple of years and try it out and see if you like it. Well, that was in 2005. So I still live in Israel. Eventually my parents came with my sister, and my sister became an officer in the Israeli Navy. So we're very proud of her as well. And we all live in Israel now. And you were asking about my future, my children. I hope, please God, that I have 2 children. I have a 6-month-old baby, and I have a 3-year-old. I hope that they will stay in Israel too. I think it's a wonderful place for a Jewish person, for any person, but for me as a Jewish person to live. I look forward to raising my children there and for them to grow up in a place that feels like it's truly their home. In the U.S., I can't say that there may be one time in my life that I really experienced any anti-Semitism, but in Israel, it's really home. I feel like I fit in. So, very happy.